welcome everybody. My name's Mark Mazower, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Téa Obreht, who is going to chat about her work and then perhaps read a few bits, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. And I will try to keep my part in this to a minimum, since you really come to hear Téa. But as you probably know, Téa was born, appropriate enough for an author of magical realism. She was born into a country that no longer exists. And after a brief sojourn in Cyprus and slightly lengthier sojourn in Egypt, grew up in the United States. And as you will all know, is the author of The Tiger's Wife, a wonderful novel, which, amongst other things, won the Orange Prize for Fiction in 2011. And she's also the author of some fantastic short stories that have been published in a number of distinguished magazines. And she's been working on a new novel that she may tell us something about. So, yes, make yourselves comfortable in the front. To kick things off then, I was thinking, as I was reading this novel, about an author who I know you admire a great deal. That's to say, Ivo Andrić. And one of the remarkable things about Ivo Andrić, who was a Nobel Prize winner from Yugoslavia, was that the war interrupted his day job as a diplomat, and there he was sitting in his apartment in Belgrade while the bombs were falling, and awful things were happening, and penning these incredible novels in which he meditates about the history of his country and people, and war is there, but war is always there at a remove. It's at a remove in The Bridge on the Drina, and it's at a remove in Travnik Chronicles in a different kind of way, and war is there in The Tiger's Wife. Wars that ravage the same country, but war is again in the background. And I wondered if you'd like to say something about this relationship of the novel to a country's very tormented history and recent history, where what we think we know about the country is pushed right into the background, as we read, quite deliberately.
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. This is such a pleasure for me. I'm going to apologize right off the bat for sounding the way I do. I apparently have the plague, so if I fall face down at some point, just give me a minute. I'll come right back up. I thank you so much for that for the question. When I started writing the novel some years ago, I made very few conscious decisions at the beginning. I really had no idea what I was doing, but one of the only things that I was, of which I was acutely aware, was that I wanted to write a novel in which war played a part but was not in the foreground. And I realized that the stories I had heard about people surviving through war were often stories of everyday life, the stories of people mythologizing their circumstances or even embellishing on minutiae of the everyday, which was actually what they had focused on while these terrible things were going on in the background. And I think that my experience of people who had come through war was that they attempted as much as they could to push it as far into the background as they could. So it seemed like a very natural sort of pasting into the background, this constant state of turmoil. And it enabled me to write a book that was more about human narrative than it was about, textbook particulars, of which everybody who was watching the news in the early 90s was very much aware. So there's no actual names or places. It's just sort of this wash of unpleasant background noise.
But it's very much about the Balkans.
Yes.
That's very clear. So it's definitely a book about the Balkans, yes. And you don't have to be knowledgeable about the Balkans to know that. So what struck me was again, the way the novel deliberately eludes something else. That you're somebody you come from Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, you're in America, the war is going on and then the war is over, and the thing that most people know about the country is that there was a war there. And if you ask them something else about it, well, they'll say it was about ethnicity. And you push them a little further and they'll say, well, there were Croats and there were Serbs, and maybe they will know there were Muslims. Personally, I remember being very much involved in the 90s in England, discussing the war and being quite infuriated by this kind of simple template that was being imposed upon these events, which was so different to everyday reality. And so the other thing that struck me about this book is that there's, I would say, virtually no ethnicity in the book at all.
Yeah, it's a thank you. I think that whenever anybody observes any narrative of conflict, they want to know immediately, you know, for simplification, who's the bad guy and who's the good guy, and just tell me this right off the bat and let me, you know, align myself with the correct side. And what was very, very complicated, I think, for a lot of people who came from the former Yugoslavia at the time was that a lot of families like my own were very mixed. I am a half Slovene, half Bosnian. My stepdad, who was born in Belgrade, my stepdad is an Orthodox Serb. In my family, we do Christmas twice. We do, you know, the Roman Catholic fun, awesome Christmas, and then we have the sort of the somber, sad version, like 2 weeks later. But it was, I think that it was very, very complicated for a lot of people because it was about not just these big atrocities about which everybody heard and which everybody could identify from the news, but about small, everyday atrocities from your neighbors and, you know, people who maybe did identify with a particular ethnicity or people whom you offended by not. So there was a lot of it was very complicated, and the ethnicity, the treatment of ethnicity in the book, I think, especially because the book deals with mythology, fell on a pattern that I saw after I started going back, which is that regardless, in some ways, regardless of people's ethnicities now and ethnicities then, there's this sort of undercurrent of narrative of oppression, because no matter where you come from in the Balkans, you were under somebody's heel for a particular period of time. And reflected in that narrative of oppression, this sort of old pagan mythology and old pagan superstition that everybody sort of has across the board. And then there's sort of a complication there as well, because, you know, there's an urban versus rural feeling, but nevertheless, a lot of people are very, very suspicious and superstitious, regardless of their particular ethnicity. And I think that was something that really connected it for me. I wanted it to be about these narrative similarities and similarities in storytelling.
So perhaps this is getting something that the book is very much about, which is animals.
Yes.
The animals, in some ways, are the real protagonists of this book, and the relationship between the animal world and the human world, as you would expect in a world of superstition, is a very blurred one. But it struck me that writing about animals is something very dear to you, and you've done it also. I mean, I've read a number of short stories of yours that are where animals feature in heroic roles as well, in a way, rather carnivorous heroic roles sometimes. Could you say a little bit about writing about animals in this book in general? What is the significance of this world that is populated by animals?
Sure. So this book actually began. It's a several-part answer. This book began with the image of an animal. I was when I moved to Ithaca, upstate New York, to attend Cornell for my MFA. I came from LA and basically hadn't seen seasons in like 20 years, because before that I had been in Cairo while we were refugees. And experienced seasons for the first time, and my reaction for this was to just go underground and hide in my apartment and not come out for just 6 months, which was really useful for writing, and I recommend it highly for anyone here who's but the National Geographic, which I binge watched to this day, had this special on tigers. They had Big Cat Week, and they had this special on tigers, and they focused on Siberian tigers in this one particular show, and it was about this Russian scientist, and he had an enclosure with some semi-wild cubs that he was raising and observing, and he had this wife, and I thought, ooh, he's got tigers, he's got a wife, tiger wife. And I wrote this short story that was absolutely awful about a young circus performer who loses her circus-performing tiger in this Balkan village. And even though the story was terrible, I kept coming back to this image of a tiger in the snow because sort of in biological terms, it's such a strange and incongruous image. I mean, there's no camouflage, there's nothing. There's just this orange thing in the middle of a snowy forest, and yet somehow it survives. So as the book sort of continued, I started writing from the point of view of the tiger. There were sections that were very close third point of perspective on the tiger, and it was this tremendous indulgence for me. And it enabled me to sort of really flex these show not tell muscles as much as I could, and really, for lack of a better way to put it, and really go out there in terms of trying to describe a character's experiences. And I enjoyed it very much, and it was this reprieve from other areas that were dealing with sort of much darker themes. After I wrote the book, I started listening to and reading Joseph Campbell, who is just awesome and whom I love dearly, dearly, and whom you should all read or listen to immediately, if not sooner. But he talks a lot about animals as sort of having these totemic properties, and I realized after I started reading him that I did write a great deal about animals. And I realized that rather than having these sort of totemic or shamanic qualities in my work, animals are thrown into these environments in which they don't belong. And a character is confronted with the animal as sort of a physical manifestation of some sort of choice that they're making. And it's something that I fall back on, not because it's comfortable, but because it's a little bit actually uncomfortable. So, yeah, that's how that... I'm not sure if that answers the question at all.
Beautifully, but it strikes me that the animals come out very well and the humans come out very badly. And the tiger in particular is rather a nice tiger, really, and is rather decent to people, and it's the humans that behave badly towards it.
It's true, and I think that had a lot to do in this book in particular about had a lot to do with this with narrative weight, because the tiger isn't he isn't feared in the village because of what he actually does, but what he represents, or what, or the narrative weight that he actually carries with him. I mean, these are people who live in an isolated community, who live nowhere near any place where tigers naturally exist. He's an escaped tiger from a zoo, and I think that the book, in many ways, was about the stories that we carry around and the effects of that. But so I think that the tiger is one of the tiger and the tiger's wife. Additionally, they both carry this sort of these stories that don't actually belong to them at all. That belong to a community that has decided that they will unify against this one particular trope, which isn't actually even aware of its own role in this unification.
So perhaps I can turn to some of your more recent writing. And of course you live in American. maybe, I don't know.
I am, yes, I'm naturalized.
Okay. You wrote a wonderful piece for Harper's on vampires.
Yes.
At the end of which you started saying very interesting things about the American obsession with vampires. And perhaps you'd like to say, and that struck me as an interesting way of using your knowledge of one place to think about another place and about the differences or similarities, but differences in this case between really rather unpleasant, smelly Serbian vampires and extremely hygienic, moralistic, world-saving American vampires. You probably haven't thought about vampires since then, or maybe you have, I don't know. But
No, I have. I've really had to, because once a vampire hunter, always a vampire hunter. No, I went to Harper's had me go to Serbia and Croatia both, and sort of visit these villages that were connected historically to the origins of vampire lore. And I met, wonderful people, often nonagenarians, who claimed to have, coexisted with vampires or seen vampires or been visited by vampires, and for them, the vampire it could basically be anything. I mean, you learn about all these systems by which a vampire is made, and you start with like the basic of, it's a corpse, it's a walking corpse, it's very much sort of a zombie-like figure, and usually it's got garlic sticking out of parts of it that has been ineffective in keeping it in the coffin, and it's sort of like out in the field or in your room or wherever. But then you can also vampirize something by having a black cat jump over it on a full moon night, and it could be another cat, or it could be a corpse, or it could be a pumpkin, and like it's this state of unrest and disease, and this coping mechanism for explaining why sometimes I guess people would dig up corpses to move them, and they would have grown hair and nails, and people would be like, well, that's great, what does that mean? And it's sort of stayed this thing. It's a plague. It's a carrier of disease. And here, vampires, as you say, are these heroic figures. And I think it has something to do with the way people process the notion of death. I mean, we are a youth-obsessed culture. We're a beauty-obsessed culture. In some ways, youth and beauty are, perpetual antidotes to the process of decay and aging. It's very prevalent all the time. It's around you all the time, even if you don't subscribe to it. And there's this idea that death only happens when you allow it to, as opposed to a slightly darker Balkan notion of death, which is like, basically, it's around the corner, and any day could be your last. Have a fun walk home. So that was.
So we should all be happy to be here, really. Would you like to say something about what you've been working on latterly?
Sure. I've been going back to short stories a good deal, which makes me very happy. It's a different form, but it's a fun one to sort of flex muscles in. It's a different kind of information delivery system, which I enjoy very much. But I have a second novel in the works as well, which is a little bit of a post-apocalyptic Western, I'm afraid, about the building of a community centered on a tower made out of junk. That holds people's memories. Yeah, that's.
What drew you to the idea of apocalypse? And is that a peculiarly American obsession? Is there something? Are you turning your attention to the States? It strikes me. I don't know that there is the same interest. I don't know the former Yugoslavia so well, but if I think about Greece, I don't think of the apocalyptic quality that you see in TV series and programs that you do here. here Hollywood is obsessed by apocalypse. Is there something American about that, do you think?
I mean, I think that there's definitely something. There's something in the cultural fabric that I think that thankfully in the States we haven't in history actually experienced anything approaching an apocalypse. Thank God. But in so many other places, when regimes collapse or wars come and they last for on the soil on which you live for years or decades, or quiet wars that go on for forever. Basically, the systems collapse all the time, and I think that they feel to the people who are experiencing them like small apocalypses all the time. So I think that I mean I think that for me, I often write about the things with which I'm preoccupied, and war is always a form of apocalypse. But there are definitely days when you look at the news and you're like, wow, this is it. Like, we're 3 days away, and it's all just going to hell, like everything. And it's sort of, in some ways, to write about the subject is a way to work through concerns and fears for me, always. My first novel I wrote as a response to the fact that my grandfather had died, and I had a huge crisis about what death actually meant. I'm very interested now in the idea of how life goes on after terrible, terrible things. So yeah.
Which is a continuation of some pretty important themes in The Tiger's Wife. I mean, if you're the deathless man,
yeah,
life goes on after terrible things all the time.
Yeah.
And that doesn't look so great either in some ways. I mean, he's a very enigmatic way of getting at that.
Yeah. He's, yeah, thank you. Yes, it was. I remember writing the character of the Deathless Man, and it's thank you so much. Thank you. He came about. He's actually he's a figure, or a version of him is a figure in German and Slavic myth as well. He's usually this sort of village fool who tricks death and then he's punished. He's in these very, very short moralistic narratives that are, you're gonna die, you're gonna die. Like that's the theme. I started thinking about how immortality, which I guess goes back to vampires as well, how immortality is a punishment. Because my own grandfather had died, and I couldn't get my mind around it. And at first, he was this very sort of sinister character, and he was always like lurking in rooms. And I thought it was being really subtle about his parallel to death. He had like this, big black trench coat and like a big black hat, and he had an axe. And I was like, this is really subtle. This is masterful work. But then I write really late at night, and when I was living in Ithaca, I wrote with my desk facing the wall, and so I found myself often in these situations writing the character and being like, the deathless man walked into the room. He was really very nice, just... but then it turned out that he was quite sad, and he was quite sad all the time, and it was because he had to, look at this scope of atrocity forever and ever and ever. And I think that what's sort of coming to mind is the fact that mortality is one of those things that actually is a really, really good impetus for sorting things out, because everybody actually does want to live in a world that is fine. Yeah.
I'm sure we'd like to hear you read, but perhaps before we do, I'd be interested to hear you say something about how you write. You alluded to this a bit. Could you tell us a bit? Was it something you had to learn over time? What works best for you? What doesn't? What times of day? What's it like? Yeah, sure.
My writing process for the Tiger's Wife was basically all night from around 8 p.m. till 4 or 5 in the morning. I didn't see a lot of people. You know, friends would call me once a week and be like, "Are you alive?" But I wrote late at night and for hours on end. And you know, now when I read parts of the book now, I actually have absolutely no memory of having written them because it was in such a different mind state. But I think that you're always learning how to write, and different processes work for different people, and different processes work for different narratives at different times in your life. It hasn't been so effective for me writing at night, living in New York, because there's things to do. But so, you know, it's often about designating several hours of the day. And for me, I hit a very particular moment where everything else sort of ceases to exist. And this is something that's really prevalent in novel writing in particular, because by the time you get to a point where you're working on a big project, and there's all these characters and all these timelines that you're dealing with, and, you know, you have your notebook, but if you step away from it for a particularly long time, you come back and you're like, who are these people and what are they doing? There's no memory whatsoever. So you're the only inhabitant of a world that only exists when you're there. And you have to sort of stay with it all the time.
And is that a time when you're not reading? I was wondering what the relationship is between your reading and your writing. Or do you read to distract yourself, or do you find as you write that in fact you're drawing on things that you read a long time ago? Were you reading at the time that you were writing the book?
I think I read very specific things. I read Pablo Neruda when I sort of want to clear my head. I read books that to me feel good and familiar and safe in the sense that I know they're not going to warp what I'm trying to do. So I read Garcia Marquez, and then I am always reading Mikhail Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita, because that's a book that I adore and I know won't. There's no chance that I'm going to even approximate it, so it's a totally safe book to read. But it's wow, that felt dead.
But no, I'm curious about this. So you read not to be distracted in a way, and you read not to be. I mean, taking your word, you read not to be influenced, or you find you are being influenced.
I read not to be influenced. I read to be sort of. I find that it's sort of, you know, that function on your iPhone where when you're lost and like you can't quite figure out your GPS, and then it says do this to recalibrate. I think that's what reading is for me when I get deep into the writing. It's just sort of trying to find the center. So, yeah.
Maybe you'd like to read some bits for us.
Sure, absolutely. I know we've been talking a lot about the Balkans and about mythology. So I was thinking that I might read. Actually, I might read the first meeting of the Deathless Man and the grandfather. How are we doing? Okay on time? Yes, we're okay. All right. This particular portion of the book is Natalia is a doctor. For those of you who may not have read it, Natalia is a doctor, and her grandfather has died, and she's trying to figure out the circumstances behind his death, which are sort of mysterious to her, based on stories that he told her throughout his life. And one of the prevalent narratives has been of his relationship with a man who claims to be immortal. And so this is their first meeting, and most of the book is first person from Natalia's point of view, but this is actually first person from the grandfather, as the grandfather is telling it. And I used to try to do the distinguished voice, but now I don't do it anymore because people just laugh. So if you can just imagine me doing it. This is late summer, 1954, not 55. That's the year I met your grandma. I am first triage assistant for the battalion, and my apprentice, God rest him, or intern, as you would call it, is this brilliant little Hungarian fellow who has paid a lot of money to study at our university, but who doesn't speak a word of the language. God knows why he's not in Paris or London. He's that apt with a scalpel, but he's not apt at much else. At any rate, a call comes in from this village where there is a sickness. Some people have died, and those still living are afraid. There is a terrible cough and blood on their pillows in the morning. This is about as mysterious to me as an empty milk saucer when there's a big fat cat in the room and the cat has a ring of milk on its whiskers and everyone is asking where the milk has gone. So we hitch a wagon ride to this village. The man who greets us is called Maddock. He is the son of the big man in town and has been to university. He is the man who sent the wire asking us to come. He's short and stocky, and he leads us through the village and into his father's house. His sister is this fat, pleasant-looking woman, very much what you'd expect. She gives us coffee and bread with cheese, which is a nice change from all the porridge we've been eating back at barracks. Then Maddock says, "Gentlemen, something new is at hand, and I expect that he will say, the epidemic's gotten worse, more death, mass hysteria, and I am partly right, especially about the hysteria." Apparently, this is how it stands. A man has died, and there has been a funeral. At the funeral, this man, who is called Gavo, sits up in his coffin and asks for water. This is an immense surprise. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the procession is following the casket up the churchyard slope to the plot. First, there's the noise of the body sliding in the coffin, and when the lid comes off, there he is, this man, Gavo, as pale and blue-faced as the day they found him. He sits up in his pressed suit, hat in hand, folded purple napkin in his pocket. An immense surprise. High up, held aloft in his coffin like a man in a boat, he looks around the procession with red eyes and says, "Water." That is all. By the time the pallbearers have realized what's happened, by the time they've dropped the coffin and fled like crazy men into the church, this man has already fallen back into the casket. That is what Maddock tells us regarding this new development. From where we are sitting in Maddock's house, I can see out the open door and down the road leading across the field and through the churchyard. I have only just noticed that the town is very empty and that at the door of the little church there is a man with a pistol, the undertaker, Maddock tells me, who hasn't slept for 6 days. I am already thinking it would be far more productive to help this man, the undertaker. Meanwhile, Maddock is still telling the story, and in it, the man Gavo does not rise from his coffin again. This is helped by the fact that some unknown member of the funeral procession fires 2 bullets from an army pistol into the back of Gavo's head while he's sitting up in the coffin right after the pallbearers drop it. Never mind why someone is so very prepared to fire a gun at a funeral. Maddock only tells us this part of the story after he has had 2 or 3 glasses of plum brandy. I am taking notes this whole time and wondering about how this Gavo ties into the sickness I am there to treat. When Maddock mentions the 2 bullets, I put my pencil down and say, "So the man was not dead?" No, Maddock says, "Most assuredly, he was dead." "Before the bullets were fired?" I ask, because it seems to me that this whole business is taking a different route, and now they're just making things up to cover murder. Maddock shrugs and says, "It is a surprise, I know." I continue to write, but what I am writing does not make much sense, and Maddock looks with interest across the table and reads what I'm writing upside down. My assistant, who I suspect has not understood any of this, is staring intently at me for some sort of explanation. I say, "We will have to see the body." Maddock's hands are on the table, and I can see that he is a man who bites his nails when he is nervous. He has been biting them a lot recently. He says to me, "Are you sure this is necessary?" "We will have to see it." "I don't know about that, doctor." I've been making a list of all the people that I want to speak with, anyone who is sick, all the family members of this revenant fellow Gavo, and especially the priest and undertaker who are most likely to know about his condition before he was shot. I say to Maddock, "Mr. Maddock, many people are at risk here. If the man was sick, he was not sick." "I'm sorry, he was perfectly healthy." My assistant is looking in abject confusion from Maddock to myself. He has known me long enough to process that the expression on my face is probably not one of delight, and he is obviously puzzled by what is going on. Maddock himself doesn't look too good either. I say, "Very well then, I will tell you how I see it. As far as the village goes, including Mr. Gavo himself, I am confident that my findings will probably arrive at a diagnosis of consumption. It is consistent with the symptoms you've described to me, the bloody cough and so forth. I would like to have all the people who are sick assembled in your town hospital as quickly as possible, and also to place the town under quarantine until we can assess the extent of the illness. And here, he catches me off guard because he says sharply, "What do you mean, tuberculosis?" He looks very distraught, and I would expect him to be distraught at tuberculosis, but I would expect a different kind of alarm. The way he looks at me, I feel like my diagnosis doesn't suit him. It's inadequate, not severe enough. Maddock says, "Couldn't it be something else?" I tell him, "No, not with these symptoms, not with people falling dead one by one and leaving bloody pillows behind." I assure him that it will be all right, that I will send out for medicine, nurses, and another city physician to help me. He wants to know, what if that doesn't help? I tell him it will. If it's tuberculosis, he says, "If you're right." I am not entirely certain where this is going. What if you're wrong? What if it's something else, Maddock says. By this time, he is very agitated, and he says, "I don't think you understand, sir. I really doubt you understand." "Well, tell me about it," I say. "Well," says Maddock, "there is blood on our pillows, and there was blood on the lapels of Gavo's coat. Because you shot him." Maddock almost falls out of his seat. "I didn't shoot him, doctor. He was already dead." I'm scribbling again, mostly just to look official. My assistant is sweating in frustration. I say I will need to speak with his family. He has no family. He's not from around here. He was some sort of peddler from far away. We didn't know anything about him. We wanted to do right by burying him here. To me, this is becoming more and more frustrating, but I think maybe that's why they're all suddenly coming down with tuberculosis. Maybe he was infected and brought it in, even though he seemed perfectly healthy to them. But he has only been here for a short time, certainly not enough to get the whole village sick, but obviously long enough for them to shoot him in the back of the head. Who will give me permission to dig up the body? You don't need it. Maddock is wringing his hands. We nailed the coffin shut, and then we put him in the church. He's still in there. So there we are, my assistant and I, standing in the little stone church at Bistrina, and the coffin of the man called Gavo is there, lying at an angle from the door as if it's been shoved in pretty quickly. It's a dusty wooden coffin. The church is stone and quiet. It smells of sandalwood and wax, and there is an icon of the Virgin above the door. The windows are blue glass. It is a beautiful church, but it is obvious that no one has been in it for a long time. The candles are all out, and this fellow's coffin is covered with a few spatters of white, which the doves that live in the belfry have been dropping down on him. It is a sad thing to see, because as far as I know, this man has done nothing to deserve being shot in the back of the head at his own funeral twice. After we come in, the undertaker closes the door behind us quickly and suddenly, and for a long time everything is quiet in the little church. We've come in with our satchels, and we've also brought a crowbar to open the coffin, and we begin to realize that perhaps we should have brought more than just the crowbar. A team of oxen, for example, because the coffin has not only been nailed shut, but also crisscrossed with extra boards across the lid and chained around and around with what looks like a bicycle chain. Someone, probably as an afterthought, has thrown a string of garlic onto the coffin, and the heads are lying there in their paper shells. My assistant manages to say to me, "Shame, awful shame." Then he spits and says, "Peasants." And then we hear something that is altogether incredible, something you cannot even begin to appreciate, because without hearing for yourself the way it sounded in the quiet church, you won't believe it happened. It is the sound of shuffling movement, and then, all of a sudden, a voice from the coffin, a frank, polite, slightly muffled voice says, "Water." Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Téa. Well, I was going to ask you to read more, but it's hard to follow that. And I know that there will be people who have questions that they'd like to ask. So if it's all right with you, perhaps what we'll do is throw it open to the floor. And if you put your hand up, then I will try and be the referee, as it were. Okay? So if anybody would like to ask a question, just put your hand up.
Thank you for speaking to us tonight.
Sure.
You spoke a little bit about illness in terms of the short stories, but both sickness and medicine play a large role in The Tiger's Wife, as we saw in that piece you just read. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the role played by doctors and medicine in your book.
Sure. Thanks for that. One of the only other conscious decisions that I made at the outset of writing this book was that there were going to be doctors. I have a few friends in Serbia who were going through medical school at the time when I was starting to write the book, and they had already headed in that direction before I started writing, and there was this wealth of stories already that I had been exposed to about young doctors of my generation, or young doctors-to-be of my generation, who were extremely frustrated at their own efforts to try and engage with an older population that was resistant to modern medicine in many ways. And because I wanted the book to be about towing the line between reality and fantasy and reality and magic, I knew that doctors would be the right conduit for that. Excuse me. So that sprang up right away, and then, of course, as I was writing, people got deeper and deeper into medical school and sort of deeper and deeper into these narratives. But, you know, I don't think it's necessarily just a symptom of living in a war-torn place. I think that doctors, for people who, especially for people who don't have occupations that are anywhere near on that level, you know, it seems like this very mysterious gatekeeper between life and death all the time. And of course, now I know that a lot of people who've been through medical school, they're not casual about it, but death is something that they have to encounter every day, and so they have a wall too. But it seemed narratively like the only choice for the kind of journeys that the people in this book were going to have to take. So, yeah, thank you.
I just wondered if you could talk a little about the difference for you in terms of writing novels and short stories, both in terms of process and what you see as kind of the limitations or freedoms of the two forms.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for the question. I think the novel is it's a much freer form, and in some ways it's great because you can make your mistakes and then learn from them there. And in a short story, I think you have to be aware of what your mistakes as a storyteller could be from the very beginning and rein it in, because the physical limitations of the form mean that every detail that you put on the page absolutely has to be there, or what the hell is it doing there? There's also, you know, you start writing a novel, and the problem that I've had for the last almost 3 years has been I started and there's no end in sight, and there's no, you know, it's not just that there's no light at the end of the tunnel, like it's not even a tunnel, it's just life. And so for short stories, which when I started writing and still to this day, I would be able to get a first draft out in a week, maybe. It's an amazing thing to be able to have the whole world of what you're dealing with in front of you and to start tinkering with it right away. It's like that instant gratification experiment that they used to do with the pigeons, where it was like, well, if you tap it twice and wait for 2 seconds, you'll get extra seeds. As opposed to short story, you're just tapping it for that one seed as fast as you can. So, so it's a great, it exercises an entirely different part of your narrative ability because of the limitations of the form, and I love it. I really do, and I love reading good short stories. It's a real indulgence. Yes, thank you.
I'm so glad that you chose the Deathless Man scene to read from, because I love it very much. And one of the things I especially admired while I was reading it is that I really love the way that you build suspense in that chapter, because there's an extent to which we already know what's going to happen. We know that he's called the Deathless Man, so it's not entirely a surprise when he sits up in the coffin, and yet it's a huge surprise. And I felt on the edge of my seat through the whole conversation between the grandfather and the other characters leading up to that. And I just would love to hear how, you've talked a little bit about how some things are conscious and other things are not. But as far as building suspense is a conscious decision, I'd love to hear how you decide, most specifically, just what to reveal and what not to reveal and when, because I thought that was really skillfully done.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really interesting question that I actually just taught a week-long workshop at the Heyman Center in the New York Public Library about information tactics and the information exchange and what it is that actually keeps a reader intrigued or invested. I used to teach a composition class for freshmen called The Mystery and the Story, in which we read mystery fiction from its start with Edgar Allan Poe all the way through hard-boiled and noir and sort of mystery films now. And I think that one of the key elements that I've realized about my own predilections as a reader is that when you start to read anything with a question, with an element of mystery in it, your desire is cabled to the fact that the author knows and that you have a need and a belief that sooner or later the author's knowledge and your knowledge are going to match up. And the question then begins. So the question when you're making those kinds of decisions as a writer isn't necessarily the most obvious mystery. Like you said, we know that he's undead and potentially a vampire. So then the interesting thing to play with is what is the information that actually is going to level off those scales, and what is it that we really, really want to know? And I think that question in this book, for me as a writer and somebody who is using the writing of this book to work through, certain questions that I had of myself was, is this a universe in which the supernatural is possible, or is this a universe in which there's an explanation for every supposedly supernatural element? So that's sort of how that suspense worked out in my mind. I'm so glad you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you.
If I can follow from that, also, it's not just the suspense. It's the beginning of maybe the most important relationship in the book, which is the relationship between the grandfather and the Deathless Man. And that's what grabs us. And in a way, the power of the book is that you make us really want to understand the grandfather figure. And we see that we know that he's died, that this is going to be the critical relationship. So it's his reactions that are so gripping for us, and then that just unfolds, and it becomes a kind of friendship between them in the most extraordinary way. Sorry, it wasn't a question.
Thank you.
Hi. I know you said it was your first transition from short stories into novels, and it is such a sprawling narrative, it's great, and everything comes together at the end. But I was wondering, how did you make that decision to determine how deep you would go into each character's personal narrative? Because some characters are more mysterious than others, and then you have some like the bear hunter, which you get into their personal backstory. So I was just wondering, how did you determine how you would develop and get into each character in a broader sense of the story?
Sure, thank you. So I, that particular, there's in the narrative of The Tiger's Wife, in the storyline of The Tiger's Wife, there are 3 characters who get sort of super in-depth treatment in terms of their life stories. One of them is Luca, the butcher. The other one is Darisha the bear, and the third is the candlestick maker. No, the apothecary gets that in-depth treatment, and I started with the butcher because I knew that he was going to have this sort of villainous role in the story, and in particular in the way the grandfather as a child saw him, and sort of the atrocities that he was capable of in terms of his relationship with the young woman. And I didn't want to be an apologist for his behavior in any way. I didn't want to excuse it, but I wanted to understand it for myself. So I wrote this background and realized that for myself to understand him as a character, and then I realized that actually it played a role in the story because it was an untold narrative. And it had a link back to the Deathless Man as well, and it was a narrative that other people wouldn't necessarily have known about Luca, but that was critical to sort of understanding the time period. And then I wanted the same for Darisha the bear. The only person that I knew wasn't going to get that full treatment was the tiger's wife herself, because she's sort of a voiceless character, and she's this mirror that everybody else pings their beliefs on, and the others don't actually get that treatment. So for me, it was a matter of expanding the universe of the book, not just this way, but in 3 dimensions, for my own understanding, and then it seemed to work. So thank you so much. Thanks.
Hi. I hope you don't mind going back to the grandfather for a bit, but
no?
Because of a broken tape deck, I actually ended up reading The Tiger's Wife out loud to my mom on a long car ride, and it prompted her to tell me the weirdest stories about my grandfather, which was really lovely because I hadn't heard them before.
That's
I was
awesome.
wondering if dealing so closely with Natalia's loss and her memories of her grandfather, did that change your memories of your grandfather or how you thought about him? Was that a difficult relationship?
It actually really, really did. My grandfather. Thank you for the question, and that's so cool, by the way. That's something that happened, and thank you for telling me that, and kudos to you for also being able to read while driving, which is actually a skill. Or while being driven without throwing up, which is also a skill. So my grandfather and I were really, really close. I didn't have a dad, and he raised me, and he was always this sort of superimposing, just totally invincible figure, and then he just died. And we had lived together. The Balkan family often is nuclear in a very strange sort of way. You live with your whole household all the time, and so I had actually lived with my grandfather up until I was like 13, 14 years old. And it was a huge loss for me, and I started processing a lot of the stories that he had told me, and actually almost none of them in this book are stories that he used to share. The one about him falling into a pit with the sheep is, but in the beginning. It was a relationship based on storytelling, the way it is with the grandfather and Natalia here. And I remember sort of starting to write this book, and I was like, oh, this is a narrator who has a grandfather who died. That's totally unrelated to my current plight. And then 8 months later being like, wow, her grandfather is sort of a little bit similar to some other grandfather you might know, but that's completely still unrelated in all ways. And then, finally seeing very small elements of my grandfather that emerged in like the way that the grandfather in the book talked, and realizing that I had done this thing that sort of extended my ability to spend time with him. It was a very cathartic process because I made things up that weren't real, and the character in this book wasn't real, but I had nevertheless managed to spend time in that emotional state. And that was huge for me. So much so that I ceased to feel, this is sort of, I'm sorry, I stopped feeling. I would go visit my grandfather's grave. He's buried in Belgrade, and it stopped having any sort of emotional resonance for me whatsoever to be at the gravesite, because I felt that I had done this sort of, my emotional space was inhabited somewhere else and not here. And that was huge for me. So yeah. Thank you for the question.
Hi. So I'm curious to know what you make of the label magical realism, and if it was, as you were writing The Tiger's Wife, if it was a genre or a label you were conscious that you were writing towards, or whether it was something that came after you'd already written the novel.
Yeah, sure. I think that I wasn't, magical realism in its strictest definition is something that I very much enjoy reading. But when I was writing the book, I wasn't writing toward a particular, I think you're always writing toward things you enjoy. So it makes sense that in some ways that people have referred to the book as magical realism, even though that is actually like a Latin American form. And I think I knew that I wanted to deal with the very explicit boundaries between reality and the supernatural, because those are the questions that the book raised. And then afterwards, people started. I don't know. I don't think that it's my place as the writer to peg it in a particular way. So if lovers of magical realism read it as something that falls into that category, then great. And if they don't, that's great. But it's it's obviously very flattering to be when people say it about the book. But I wasn't aiming for that particular field. So thank you.
I really liked your reading, by the way.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, you said earlier that you look over whole parts of the book now and you can't even remember writing them. I'm wondering what you feel like rereading parts of the book. Like, what goes through your mind? What is your opinion on, like, how well it went, stuff like that?
I think that a lot of writers I know are constantly editing. And I constantly edit the book still when I read it. I think that you are. I don't think I've ever looked at a piece of my writing and been like, "That's perfect." And maybe I never will, and maybe people reach a point where they're like, "I can't," But you're constantly developing as a writer, and at every stage in your development, you are, you're learning new things, and you're learning new things about your own particular tendencies and the tics that you have and the crutches you lean on, and the things that get you through one sentence to the next. And I think that it's a very it's a valuable learning process still to read it again. And to be able to look at it and say, well, that's a word that shouldn't be there, so when I read it out loud, I'm not going to include it. But it's one of my professors at Cornell, J. Robert Lennon, who's a wonderful, wonderful teacher and a great writer, I told him that I wanted to, his workshop was the one that I had written the short story, The Tiger's Wife, in, and it was just massacred in the workshop. It was amazing. It was just awful. I came out and my head was on backwards. But I said to him, I think that, I've been working on this short story that was total dreck in your class, and now instead of 35 pages of crap, I have 50. And I think I'm working towards a novel. And he said, that's great. He said, that's great. A novel and a short story are completely different efforts structurally. Have a good weekend. And and I was just like, oh my God, what does that mean? And then afterwards, he told me, I was struggling with it, and he was like, it's a novel. You're going to finish it. It'll be done, and then when it comes out, it won't be perfect, but it'll be yours. And you'll have to live with it. And I think that's, it's sort of true. I think that it's inevitable. Like, you look back on stuff that you did when you were, when you were 3 years younger, and you're like, oh my God, what was I thinking? And like, obviously I don't have that reaction. Like, I love that I somehow managed to cobble together this book. But there's certainly sentences that I read where I'm like, oh my God. And I, there's certain sentences that I might write differently now. But the thing is, you actually, everything you write is a stepping stone to what you write next. And so I think that the best that writers can ever do is be able to look at a piece and say, that was, for my ability at the time, that was the best I could do, and it's a total reflection of my mind map at the time. So if you can do that without cringing, I think.
I have one last question, which is Kipling. Where did Kipling come from? It fits so perfectly. Was it something you admired, or was he a favorite of your grandfather's, or
both? Kipling. So Kipling is it's. So I grew up. I got my English language education in Cyprus at a British school in Cyprus and in Egypt, and we read Kipling as children's literature, and that's something that actually doesn't happen as much here, which I didn't realize, because here the context historically is a lot more loaded, as it should be anywhere, but there it's children's literature. So it was a favorite of mine. It was the first book that I read in Serbo-Croatian, and then it was the first book that I read in English to myself. And this is one of those things that, part of the learning process surprises you. When I first introduced the Jungle Book into the story here, I wanted it to be a very easy sort of template way for the grandfather as a child to understand what a tiger was. Because there's, Shere Khan and then it became this whole thing. It was like a talisman a narrative that the grandfather and the granddaughter carry between them, and then it becomes a connection between the Deathless Man, and it really took me by surprise how far it went in the end. So, thank you.
Well, I guess if there are no more questions, I have lots of questions, but they can wait perhaps. Thank you very, very much
for
sharing your experiences with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.